I used to think kindness was quiet. Something small, forgettable. Just $5. A paper cup. A nod and a smile on my way to work. I never imagined that the man everyone walked past would one day be the reason I'm still alive. Because the morning he grabbed my arm and whispered my name, I realized something terrifying. He knew what was going to happen before anyone else did. And if I hadn't stopped for him all those months, this story would have ended very differently. I used to think kindness was quiet. Something small, forgettable. Just $5. A paper cup. A nod and a smile on my way to work. I never imagined that the man everyone walked past would one day be the reason I'm still alive. Because the morning he grabbed my arm and whispered my name, I realized something terrifying. He knew what was going to happen before anyone else did. And if I hadn't stopped for him all those months, this story would have ended very differently. The morning my husband died, the world didn't stop. The sun still came up. The kettle still whistled, but something inside me went silent forever. Richard and I had been married for 42 years. We met young, struggled together, built a life brick by brick. When he passed, it felt like someone had quietly removed the foundation while I was still standing on it. 18 months later, I was 63 years old, living alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the far edge of Minneapolis, trying to convince myself I was starting fresh instead of simply surviving. Richard had handled everything: bills, repairs, savings, even grocery shopping during those last few years when my hip made walking painful. After he was gone, I learned the truth. Medical expenses had drained nearly everything. The insurance barely covered the funeral. What little remained disappeared quickly. My daughter lived in Seattle, my son in Texas. They loved me, I knew that, but their lives were full, busy, and far away. Calls came less often than I needed. Silence filled the rest. So I sold the house we'd lived in for 3 decades and took the first job that didn't look at my age like a liability. The Good Shepherd Senior Center needed a part-time receptionist. 25 hours a week, $12 an hour. It wasn't much, but it gave me structure, a reason to shower, a place where people said my name. Every morning, I took the bus downtown. I always got off 2 stops early so I could walk the rest of the way. The doctor said movement would help my hip, but the truth was simpler. I needed air. I needed to feel like I was still part of the world. That's when I noticed him. He sat on the same bench outside the public library every morning. An older black man with snow-white hair and calm, watchful eyes. He wore a faded green jacket no matter the weather, sun, rain, or bitter cold. At his feet sat a small paper cup. He never asked for money, never called out, never complained. He just watched people pass. Something about him unsettled me, not in a bad way, but in a way that tugged at memories I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the dignity in the way he sat, back straight despite everything. Maybe it was the way he nodded gently at strangers who refused to meet his eyes. He reminded me of my father. The first morning I stopped, I didn't plan to. My feet simply slowed. I dropped a $5 bill into his cup and muttered, "Have a nice day." He looked up, smiled softly, and said, "God bless you, ma'am. You have a kind heart." I walked away with tears blurring my vision, unable to explain why. After that, it became routine. Every morning I stopped. Some days it was $5, some days just coins. Eventually, words followed, names. His was Samuel. Samuel Washington. He was 74, a retired high school history teacher, 35 years in the classroom. His wife had passed years earlier. His pension vanished in a fraud he never fully understood. His apartment was sold when the building converted to luxury condos. Now he slept where he could. Listening to him felt like swallowing anger I hadn't known I still carried. A man who shaped young minds reduced to invisibility. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel fair. But Samuel never complained. "The Lord provides," he'd say with a gentle smile, sometimes in unexpected ways. Over time, he learned about me too, about Richard, about my children, about my job. He remembered details I forgot I'd shared, asked thoughtful questions, offered comfort without pity. Somewhere along the way, he became my friend. The only one who noticed when I looked tired. The only one who asked how my heart was healing, not just my body. Nearly a year passed like that. Seasons changed, snow melted, life moved forward quietly. And then came the morning that changed everything. I stepped off the bus, crossed the street toward the library, and saw Samuel standing instead of sitting. His eyes scanned the sidewalk with urgency. When he spotted me, he rushed forward and grabbed my arm. "Mrs. Margaret," he said urgently, "you need to listen to me." In that moment, I knew. This was no longer just kindness. This was something else entirely. At the time, I thought he was just another man down on his luck. I had no idea. He was already paying attention to my life in ways I couldn't see. And the next morning, he would say something that made my blood run cold. For a long time after that morning, I told myself I was imagining things. Samuel had always been observant, thoughtful, kind. But the way he grabbed my arm that day, the urgency in his voice, it didn't fit the quiet routine we had built together. Still, I went to work like nothing had happened. That was my way. Keep moving. Don't stir the water. Don't invite trouble. The Good Shepherd Senior Center opened its doors at 8 every morning, and by 7:45, the lobby was already filling with familiar faces. Seniors waiting for breakfast. Volunteers signing in. Phones ringing with questions about programs and transportation. I sat at my desk, smiling, greeting everyone by name, doing the job I'd grown quietly proud of. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the bench, to Samuel's eyes, to the way he said my name like it mattered. I told myself he'd simply been startled. Maybe he'd seen something odd nearby. Maybe someone had bothered him earlier. The city wasn't always gentle to men like Samuel. By lunchtime, I had almost convinced myself to forget it. Almost. That afternoon, Samuel's voice echoed in my head while I watched the staff move through the halls. I noticed things I normally wouldn't, small interactions, quiet conversations cut short when I passed. And then I noticed her. Tiffany Reynolds. She was the new bookkeeper, hired a few months earlier after the previous one retired. Young, efficient, bright red hair and an easy laugh that made people trust her instantly. She was polite to everyone, always offering to help, always carrying folders or tapping numbers into her tablet. Everyone liked Tiffany. I did too. At least I had, until I realized she seemed to know exactly where everyone was at all times. She passed my desk more than usual that day, smiling, asking how I was, complimenting my scarf, asking about my weekend. Normal conversation, but something about it felt rehearsed. I scolded myself for being paranoid. Late afternoon, the director stopped by my desk. Patricia Holloway had been running the center for over a decade. Calm, respected, admired. She was the kind of woman people trusted without question. "Margaret," she said gently, "have you noticed anything unusual lately?" My heart skipped. Unusual how? "With donations," she said. "Any complaints, confusion from donors?" I shook my head. "Not that I know of." She nodded slowly. "It's probably nothing. One donor said her receipt didn't match her records. Tiffany's checking into it." Tiffany. The name sat heavy in my chest. That evening, As I walked back toward the bus stop, Samuel was already on his bench. He didn't smile this time. Instead, he stood as soon as he saw me, eyes alert, scanning the street. "Mrs. Margaret," he said quietly, stepping closer. "We need to talk." "Samuel, what's going on?" I asked. "You're scaring me." He pulled me gently toward the library wall, away from the flow of people. "I don't have much time," he whispered, "but you need to be careful at your job." I laughed nervously. "Careful, why?" "Watch the new bookkeeper," he said. "The red-haired one. Watch what she does with the donation records." My stomach tightened. "How do you know about that?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "People talk around me like I'm invisible. They don't realize I hear everything." He leaned closer. "And Mrs. Margaret, don't go home tonight." I stared at him. "What?" "Stay somewhere else. A hotel, a friend's place, anywhere but your apartment." Fear crept up my spine. "Samuel, you're not making sense." "I can't explain everything yet," he said urgently. "But something bad is coming, and you're closer to it than you realize." "How do you know my job details?" I demanded. "How do you know about donations?" He held my gaze. "Because someone mentioned you by name." That was when fear became real. "Come back tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll show you everything, but tonight, promise me you won't go home." I should have argued. I should have demanded answers. Instead, I whispered, "I promise." He released my arm and returned to his bench, once again just a homeless man with a paper cup. But I knew better now. I walked away with my heart pounding, realizing something I didn't want to accept. Samuel wasn't guessing. He was warning me. That night, I lay awake replaying his words over and over. "Watch the bookkeeper, don't go home." And one question wouldn't leave my mind. What had Samuel heard, and who thought I was a threat? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, Samuel's voice came back to me, low, urgent, certain. "Don't go home tonight." I told myself he was mistaken, a well-meaning man who'd overheard something and connected the dots the wrong way. That explanation felt safer than the alternative. Still, when morning came, I didn't go straight home after my shift. I packed a small overnight bag before work and left it by the door. Just in case. The bus ride downtown felt longer than usual. I watched reflections in the windows instead of the city outside, half expecting someone to be watching me. When I stepped off 2 stops early, the cold air did nothing to steady my nerves. Samuel was already at the library bench. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He just watched me approach like he was counting steps. "Did you promise?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said, "I did." He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Good. Today you act normal, don't ask questions, don't look at records, don't change your routine." "And tomorrow?" I asked. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll show you why I was afraid." At work, everything felt off. The building hummed with its usual noise. Phones ringing, laughter from the activity room, volunteers arguing about coffee. But I felt disconnected from all of it. I noticed Tiffany again. She spent a long time in the donation office that morning, longer than usual. Her door stayed closed. When she came out, she avoided my eyes. I caught Patricia watching me from her office window. When our eyes met, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Around noon, a donor called asking for clarification on a receipt. I forwarded the call to accounting like always, but my hands shook as I hung up. I remembered Samuel's words. "They mentioned you by name." Late afternoon, Patricia called me into her office. "Margaret," she said softly, "I need to talk to you about something confidential." My heart dropped. She closed the door and gestured for me to sit. "There's been an issue," she said. "We've discovered discrepancies in our donation records." I stayed quiet. "We believe someone has been skimming money," she continued. "Not a lot at first, but enough to add up." "How much?" I asked before I could stop myself. Patricia hesitated. "Nearly $40,000. The number made my head spin. "I'm telling you because I trust you," she said. "You've been reliable, honest, but the police may get involved. There will be questions." "Questions?" "About me." "Have you noticed anyone acting strangely?" she asked. "Anyone accessing files they should?" I thought of Samuel. I thought of Tiffany. And then, horrifyingly, I thought of Patricia herself. "I haven't noticed anything," I said carefully. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, that's all for now." When I left her office, my legs felt weak. Someone was stealing from the center. Someone thought I was close enough to notice. And Samuel knew. At 5 o'clock sharp, I didn't go home. I walked straight to a small budget hotel a mile from my apartment and paid for one night in cash. That night, my phone rang at 2:07 a.m. An unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Chen," a calm voice said. "This is Sergeant Rivera with the Minneapolis Police Department." My blood turned to ice. "There's been a fire at your apartment building," she continued. "Your unit was on the affected floor." I couldn't breathe. "If you had been home," she said gently, "this call would be very different." Samuel had been right. And suddenly, I understood. The warning wasn't about money. It was about my life. If I hadn't listened to Samuel, I would have been sleeping in that apartment. And the next morning, I finally learned how he knew it was coming. I stood frozen in the dim hotel room long after the police officer hung up. A fire. On my floor. In my building. My hands shook as I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying every word Samuel had said. "Don't go home. Promise me." If I had ignored him, if I had brushed off his warning like common sense told me to, there would be no part 4 of this story. At sunrise, I didn't wait for the bus. I took a cab straight downtown and asked the driver to stop near the public library. Samuel was already there. The moment he saw me step out of the car, he stood up. His shoulders sagged with visible relief. "You're alive," he whispered. "Thank God." I grabbed his hands without thinking. "Samuel, how did you know? How did you know about the fire?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he led me to the bench and sat down beside me. "People think being homeless makes you invisible," he said quietly. "But it does the opposite. You hear everything." From inside his jacket, he pulled out a small, battered notebook, the kind children use for school. Pages were filled with dates, times, names, and short observations written in neat, careful handwriting. "I've been watching your building for weeks," he said, "after I heard something I wasn't meant to hear." My chest tightened. "What did you hear?" "Two men," he said, "sitting right here on this bench, talking about money being moved, money meant for old people." My heart pounded. "They mentioned the center." He nodded. "They mentioned donation records, a bookkeeper, and then—" He turned a page. "They mentioned you." My stomach dropped. "They said an older receptionist was getting suspicious," Samuel continued. "That she knew too much." "But I didn't," I whispered. "I never looked at the records." "I know," he said gently, "but someone believed you might." He flipped to another page. "Last night, those same men came back. They talked about a fire, about making it look like an accident. They said your apartment number." My vision blurred. "Who are they, Samuel?" Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. "I followed them," he said. "I took pictures." He showed me the screen. One photo made my blood run cold. Patricia Holloway, standing beside a tall, sharp-faced man I didn't recognize. Another photo showed the same pair meeting two others at a nearby cafe. "She's not investigating the theft," Samuel said quietly. "She's running it." I felt sick. Patricia had told me about the fraud to gain my trust, to make it look like she was on the right side. And then she planned to erase me. "If I had died in that fire," I whispered, "they would have blamed me." Samuel nodded. "A tragic accident, case closed." I clenched the notebook in my hands. "We have to go to the police." "Yes," he said, "but carefully. This kind of thing doesn't stay small." I realized then what Samuel had done. For weeks, he'd listened, watched, followed people who thought he didn't matter. Risked his life to save mine. "Why?" I asked him softly. "Why help me?" He smiled. "Because you treated me like a human being." We went to the police station together. And when I handed over the notebook, the photos, and the phone, the officers stopped doubting. The investigation began that day. But the danger wasn't over. Not yet. I thought turning over the evidence would end it. I was wrong. Because the people behind the fire were already preparing their next move. The police told me to go home and try to rest. As if rest was even possible anymore. My apartment was sealed off with yellow tape, the windows blackened, the smell of smoke still clinging to my clothes when I stood across the street and stared at what used to be my safe place. They said the damage was significant but contained. What they didn't say out loud was the truth. If I'd been inside, I wouldn't have made it out. That night, the detectives began asking questions. Careful ones, precise ones, about my job, about my routine, about who I spoke to and when. They never said Patricia's name. But they didn't have to. I could see it in the way they exchanged looks when I mentioned the senior center. In the way one officer quietly stepped out of the room to make a phone call. By morning, I was officially part of the investigation. And that terrified me more than the fire. Because the people who tried to kill me weren't panicking. They were calculating. The next day, Patricia called. Her voice was calm, warm, almost motherly. "Margaret," she said, "I heard about the fire. I'm so relieved you weren't hurt." I swallowed hard. "Thank you." "You must be shaken," she continued. "Take as much time as you need. The center will support you." Support. The word felt poisonous. "Have the police spoken to you yet?" she asked lightly. "Yes," I said. A pause, barely noticeable, but it was there. "Well," she said, "just tell the truth. That's all anyone can do." After I hung up, my hands were shaking. She knew. The police advised me not to return to work. Not yet. They wanted everything to look normal from the outside. But nothing was normal anymore. 2 days later, they brought me back in. This time, the room was different. Federal agents were there. Financial crime specialists. People who didn't smile. They laid it all out. Patricia Holloway hadn't just stolen money from one center. She'd been running a long-term fraud operation across multiple senior facilities. Millions siphoned from donations meant for the elderly. The tall man in Samuel's photo was her brother, a financial consultant who helped move the money. Tiffany, the bookkeeper, her niece, brought in to keep everything quiet and clean. And me. I was the perfect scapegoat. An older receptionist, limited access, recently widowed, no family nearby. When the money vanished, the blame would land softly and permanently on me. The fire was meant to finish the story. I felt sick. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," the agent said, "we wait, and we protect our witnesses." Witnesses. Plural. That night, I thought of Samuel, the man who had given the police everything, the man who had saved my life. I went to the library the next morning. The bench was empty. No Samuel, no paper cup. My chest tightened. I checked the shelter. Nothing. By evening, panic crept in. Had they found him? Had he been silenced for knowing too much? 3 days passed before I found him. In a hospital bed. Samuel had collapsed on the street, dehydrated, malnourished, his kidneys failing. Years of untreated diabetes had finally caught up with him. I sat by his bed, holding his hand, fighting tears. "I should have done more sooner," he whispered. "No," I said, "you did everything." But deep down, I knew something else. The trap wasn't just meant for me. It was meant to make sure no one survived to tell the truth. I thought the worst was over. But as I sat beside Samuel's hospital bed, I realized something chilling. Saving my life had nearly cost him his own. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of machines, keeping Samuel alive. He looked smaller than I remembered, frail. The strength that once filled his voice was gone, replaced by exhaustion that ran deeper than his bones. I sat beside him for hours, afraid to leave. The doctor finally pulled me aside and spoke gently, but his words hit hard. Untreated diabetes, severe dehydration. He's been surviving in crisis mode for a long time, he said. If he hadn't collapsed when he did, he might not have made it another week. Another week. I thought about the weeks Samuel had spent watching my building, following strangers, writing notes late at night under streetlights, risking everything. For me. That same afternoon, the police called. "They're moving," the detective said. "We believe the suspects know the investigation is closing in." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means they're going to try to clean up loose ends." I knew exactly who those loose ends were. It was me. And Samuel. I was placed under temporary protection. Plainclothes officers outside my hotel, my phone monitored, every movement noted. Meanwhile, the investigation exploded. Accountants traced transactions through shell companies. Emails were recovered. Surveillance footage confirmed meetings Samuel had written about in his notebook. The evidence was overwhelming. Patricia Holloway was arrested first. The news showed her walking out of her suburban home in handcuffs, her face pale, her composure gone. The woman who had smiled at me across a desk now stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the cameras. Her brother was arrested 2 states away trying to flee. Tiffany was picked up at work, shocked and crying as agents escorted her out. The 4th man, the one hired to start the fire, was arrested last. When they questioned him, he broke within hours. "They told me the woman inside was already dead," he confessed. "They said it would look like an accident." I stopped breathing when the detective told me. "They thought you'd be home," he added quietly. The trial moved fast. I testified. My voice shook, but I told everything. About the donations, the warning, the fire. Then Samuel testified. They brought him in wearing a borrowed suit, his hands steady despite his frail body. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who had spent decades teaching. He explained how people ignored him, how that invisibility let him hear conversations others never could. The courtroom was silent. The jury listened. And they believed him. Patricia was sentenced to 15 years. Her brother received 12. Tiffany, 5. The man who started the fire was given 20. Justice had been served. But when the trial ended and the cameras left, I realized something painful. The world was moving on. Samuel was still fighting for his life. After the verdict, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let the man who saved me fade back into the shadows. I contacted social services, housing authorities, nonprofits, legal aid. I told Samuel's story. People listened. Donations poured in. A lawyer took his pension case pro bono. A housing organization found him an apartment. The school district, where he'd taught for 35 years, started a fund in his name. And slowly, miraculously, Samuel got better. By summer, he left the hospital. And for the first time in years, he had a key in his hand. Justice had been served. But the most important part of this story was still unfolding. Because saving Samuel changed my life just as much as he saved mine. The day Samuel moved into his new apartment, he stood in the doorway for a long time without stepping inside. The place wasn't large, just a modest one-bedroom with clean floors, sunlight through the windows, and a small kitchen that smelled faintly of fresh paint. To anyone else, it might have looked ordinary. To Samuel, it looked like a miracle. He turned the key in the lock slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too fast. "I never thought I'd have a place again," he said quietly. I watched him take it all in. The donated furniture, the boxes of books people had sent, the framed photo of his late wife I'd helped hang on the wall. This was more than an apartment. It was dignity restored. Over the next few weeks, life began to settle into something that felt possible. Samuel's health improved. His diabetes came under control. His strength returned little by little. The lawyer managed to recover part of his stolen pension. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. And I started breathing again. The senior center offered me my job back, but I declined. I needed distance, healing, a fresh start. Instead, I took a position at another community center across town, one with stricter oversight, better controls, and a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was awake. Samuel began volunteering at the library, helping children with homework. Teaching history again, only now his lessons weren't from textbooks. They were lived. Sometimes I watched from a distance as kids gathered around him, hanging on every word. No one walked past him anymore. One afternoon, we sat together over coffee. "You know," he said, smiling, "I used to tell my students that history isn't just dates and wars. It's choices." "Choices," I repeated. "Yes," he said, "the small ones, the kind that don't feel important at the time." I thought about that first morning. $5, a paper cup. A choice. "If you hadn't stopped," he continued, "none of this would have happened. And if you hadn't warned me," I said, "I wouldn't be here." We sat quietly, understanding the weight of it. Kindness hadn't just connected us. It had protected us. Life moved forward. My daughter had her baby, a little girl named Alina. My son visited for Christmas with his family. Laughter returned to my home, softly at first, then stronger. Samuel and I made a habit of meeting every morning for coffee. Same time, same place. Different bench. People sometimes asked me what I learned from everything that happened. They expected fear, distrust, bitterness. But that wasn't it. What I learned was this. When you choose to see someone the world has ignored, you might be the only reason they're still standing. And sometimes, they'll be the reason you are too. It all began with a choice so small. I almost didn't make it. And that's when I realized the ripples from kindness never stop spreading. Time has a way of softening the sharpest memories, but some moments stay clear no matter how many years pass. I'm 65 now. 2 years removed from the fire, from the trial, from the night my life nearly ended without warning. On most mornings, my life looks ordinary, and I treasure that. I still take the bus. I still get off 2 stops early. I still walk the last stretch just to feel the air on my face and remind myself I'm here. Only now, the walk ends somewhere different. Every morning, I stop by Samuel's apartment. We drink coffee together. Sometimes we talk about the news, sometimes about his students from decades ago. Sometimes we sit in comfortable silence. He's healthier now, stronger. His laugh comes easier. And sometimes he shakes his head and says, "All this from $5. But the truth is, it was never about the money. It was about stopping. About seeing someone when it's easier to look away. Samuel volunteers at the library 3 days a week. Kids rush toward him when he arrives, backpacks bouncing, questions already forming. He tells them stories, not just about history, but about choices, about how small actions can echo far beyond the moment they're made. I still work at a senior center, a different one. And every time I see a donor receipt, every time I watch someone handle records, I pay attention. I ask questions. I protect the people who trust us. Because now, I know how easily trust can be weaponized. One afternoon, a woman stopped me outside the center. "I heard your story," she said softly, "about the homeless man, about the fire." I nodded, unsure what to say. She smiled through tears. "I stopped for someone today because of you." I went home that night and cried, not from fear, but from gratitude. The ripples were still moving. Samuel once told me something I'll never forget. "When people are ignored long enough," he said, "they start believing they don't matter. And when someone finally sees them, it can save a life." He was right. Kindness saved mine. And maybe, just maybe, it's saving others too. So if you ever wonder whether small acts matter, let me tell you this. One day, the person you stop for might be the one who saves you. And that's a truth I'll carry for the rest of my life. Some stories don't really end. They just settle into you. This one lives with me every time I slow my steps instead of rushing past. Every time I meet someone's eyes instead of pretending not to see them. Because now I understand something I didn't before. Kindness is never wasted. It waits. It listens. And sometimes it comes back when you need it most. People often ask me what the most frightening part of everything was. They expect me to say the fire, or the betrayal, or the moment I realized someone wanted me gone. But the truth is, the scariest part came before all of that. It was how close I came to never knowing. Never knowing that a quiet man on a bench was watching out for me. Never knowing that my life was already being discussed in whispers by people who thought I didn't matter. Never knowing that my survival depended on a relationship the world would have dismissed as meaningless. Samuel once said something that still stays with me. "History isn't written by moments," he told me. "It's written by choices. Not the loud ones. Not the dramatic ones. The small ones. Like stopping when everyone else keeps walking. Like listening when it's easier to ignore. Like treating someone as human when the world has decided they're invisible." If I hadn't stopped that first morning, if I hadn't kept stopping, if Samuel hadn't felt seen, respected, worth protecting, I wouldn't be here. The people who planned the fire are in prison now. Their names will eventually fade into paperwork and forgotten headlines. But Samuel's story keeps growing. He still teaches. He still listens. He still reminds children, and me, that justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a faded green jacket and sits quietly on a bench, waiting for someone to care. And as for me, I no longer think of myself as a widow who lost everything. I think of myself as someone who gained a second life. Because I made one small choice on an ordinary morning. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this. The people everyone walks past may see more than you ever realize. The smallest kindness may carry the greatest weight. And you never know who's watching, or who might one day save your life. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, take a moment to be kind today. Stop. Look. See someone. You never know what ripple you might be starting.